So thanks so much for coming, and really excited to talk to you guys about soil, carbon, and climate change. And to give you a little bit of context, the goal for today's today's presentation really is to give you an idea of kind of, you may be starting to hear these words a lot, or they may be already quite familiar to you, but soil and carbon, I think, are going to be increasingly important at a variety of levels over the course of the next 15, 20 years, obviously have been for a very long time, but from a micro level, right? Think about it at your garden or your farm level. What is soil carbon? How might I think about it? From a local level, what does this mean for my local farm or forest? Maybe thinking about regenerative ag and how that fits into this. And then from a macro level, how does soil carbon and the different kind of levels we've looked at fit into the larger soil carbon market and the kind of offset and carbon markets that we see around that. So before we jump in, just so you guys have some context, I've had the pleasure of working with Wally Farms over the course of the last about year, starting to kind of think through and puzzle through how we might investigate what can be done at the intersection of soil and carbon in an ag environment. What are the most interesting, innovative ways we can draw down carbon? And how do we get those, how do we learn those things and then get them up to scale in order to affect, draw down at large and climate change, help mitigate climate change. As part of that, I have been building out a website and a platform called The Burning Question, specifically around how we might think about biochar and what people and the leaders in the field are doing right now, and how that might fit into some sort of climate mitigation strategy. So let's see. So kicking off with kind of what is soil carbon? Where does it come from? How do we make it? What does it look like? So soil organic matter is anything that was, is currently or was alive, right? So think about old grass, dead bugs, rotten wood, worm poop. That's all soil organic matter. About half of that is carbon. And you can kind of break down soil organic matter into 4 groups. You have dissolved soil organic matter. So it's about 5% of all soil organic matter, and it's basically things that the trees are producing or in the process of decomposing. You have particulate organic matter, so that's decomposing plant matter. So you think about, like, say, leaves or grass, and that lasts in the soil, say, 2 to 25 years, and that makes up about 2 to 50 years. That makes up about 2 to 25% of all of the total substance. Then you have humus or humus, which is it's older organic compounds that are breaking down, and that's like what looks like dirt, to you and me, and it makes up about half of all soil organic matter. And finally, there's resistant organic matter. So we'll get back to this because it's important, but it's relatively inert or otherwise mineralized carbon that is sequestered in the soil for hundreds or maybe thousands of years, and is typically somewhere between 2 and 10% of soil organic matter. So that's what it is. But how do you make it, right? So if you imagine looking, starting above ground, because that's where we are and it's most of what we know. If you were to look outside of your house, everything that you see is above ground. It's all the plants, right? What they're doing is synthesizing photosynthesizing CO2, so carbon dioxide, and turning it mostly into carbohydrates. So what the plant's body is made out of is carbohydrates, right? Starches and sugar, right? So they also make sugar that they use as energy, and then they trade with the rest of the soil microbial environment. So if you think about the stuff that you're looking at, trees are about half water, a quarter carbon, and a quarter other stuff like hydrogen, etc. And I think it's important, before we set off on this little journey, that when you think about soil carbon, you imagine it not as something that trees and plants take up from the ground. Trees are not made of carbon that comes from the soil. The carbon that is in the body of a tree or a plant primarily comes from the air around it. All right, so you know, the direction is down, right? They're pulling carbon down, putting it into the ground. How are they doing that? Well, roots build soil, and roots are the way that trees interact with the soil environment. And plants like you and I need more than carbohydrates to thrive, though, you know, pasta is a favorite. And what they do need, you know, they need water, which they can get directly from their roots. They also need macro and micronutrients. So the macronutrients are the kind of things that you'll see on fertilizer, like 4-4-4 or 10-10-10. That's traditionally NPK, or nitrogen, potassium, and phosphates. And in order to get those things, the plants, let me let some people in here. In order to get those micronutrients, plants trade sugar with mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria in the soil, which are better at mining these nutrients from the soil. So these are what we call symbiotic microbial partners, right? And like I said, mycorrhiza, which means fungi, micro means fungi, rhiza means root, so root fungi. And the soil microbiome is exceedingly dense and very much alive, right? So if you were to take a look at a habitat and compare it across different categories, the soil microbiome is the most biodiverse habitat on Earth. Fungi, bacteria, nematodes, viruses, all these things live in very, very, very close collaboration, right? And the reason that it's so alive, right, is because plants are feeding these, the entire system is fed by photosynthesis above ground. So I think if you think about the way that it's working, you're taking life above ground, it's taking carbon, pushing it into the soil and creating life. And so you might think that the most densely vegetated or forested places on Earth would have the highest rates of soil organic matter or soil carbon, right? It's like, okay, if that's what we're doing, maybe that's what we'll see. So if we look at this map, you can see in red, the highest levels of organic carbon are way, way, way up in like the top and bottoms of the world, right? So high is, and this is not what we see when we look at the vegetated environment, right? The Amazon rainforest doesn't have that much soil carbon when you look at what's in the soil. Does anyone have any, if you want to, you could, you know, chime in with guesses why that is. But it's super interesting, right? So if you look at the terrestrial carbon, so the green is the above ground biomass. And if you set that out on the longitude of the entire, latitude of the entire world, so the left-hand side of this graph is the Antarctic, and at the right side is the Arctic. You end up with this super interesting graph. So you're condensing all the world's above ground vegetation into a single latitude, right? And it's no surprise that the above ground latitude with the most vegetation is right around the equator, right? So that's the Amazon rainforest, sub-Saharan African rainforest, Indonesia, all these really, really densely vegetated environments. And you do see a boom in organic soil carbon in those places. But up here towards, say, the top of the world, you see some, of course, trees and things, but you see an enormous amount of soil carbon. Why is that? Well, what's happening is those are the boreal forests of Canada and Siberia. So a huge amount of landmass, a lot of trees, and for most of the year, the ground is frozen. So what's happening is instead of, we've talked about the direction of carbon down from the atmosphere into the soil, it also goes the other way, decomposition, right? So what's actually happening in the parts of the world in which there is a lot of above ground vegetation, and a lot, but not an overwhelming amount of soil carbon, is that those things are in balance, right? So the amount of carbon that's being drawn down from the air is approximately equal to the amount of carbon that's being respirated back from the soil. So because all the animals in the soil are breaking things down, they're releasing very slowly the carbon back to the air. In these really northern climates, you actually see these enormous carbon stocks because the ground is frozen for most of the year. So you have enormous amounts of carbon that is essentially being drawn down to the ground and then frozen in permafrost. And so this is why you see such concentrations at super high latitudes. So now that we kind of have an understanding of what's in the ground and how that relates to the soil, let's look at the US. And this is a graph that is produced by Cornell called Soils Revealed. And it gives us an idea of the organic soil organic carbon stock across the United States and Canada and the world, if you want to look at it. The same things hold up. The northern climates have more because they're freezing in the winter. And as you move to drier area, more arid areas, you have less soil carbon. And I think one thing that's striking about this is that this was the soil, organic soil, carbon content historically. This is what it is now. So you can see we've lost an extraordinary amount of carbon in the soil to the air. And that's because almost half the land that can support plant life on Earth has been converted to croplands and pastures and rangelands. And in that process, we've lost about 50 to 70% of the carbon that they once held. So you can see this very, very dramatic release of carbon to the atmosphere. Well, we've talked about the things that sustain life in the ground, so plants, right? So if we were to kill the plants that were feeding the whole soil microbiome, obviously that soil microbiome would die out and decompose and release the carbon back into the air. This is a super interesting way of looking at the effect of kind of destroying a plant ecosystem over the course of time, right? So this is the atmospheric CO2 levels in the world. This is May. And atmospheric CO2 changes dramatically over the course of the year as plants kind of breathe in and take in carbon dioxide from the air over the course of the growing season and release it at the end of the growing season as they decompose. So why in May do you have an enormous amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the northern hemisphere? Well, I wish I could point at the point on the map, but if you look over, that's a map of the world, you can probably make out South America and Australia. If you kind of intuit where North America is, if you look over the center of the United States and central Canada, it's dark red. If you know what's happening in the farming community in May, you know that is when they plow their soils. So what you see, and this is an annual thing, is a plume essentially of carbon dioxide that's being released from the soils as the soils are being tilled all across the center of the United States and Canada. And this replays in a variety of ways all over the world, but this one is particularly striking. This, for context, is what it looks like in August, right? No tillage, right, at that time of year generally. And as a consequence, all the plants that are pulling down, growing super fast, pulling down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You have a very different atmospheric kind of signature. So soil carbon is intimately related with atmospheric carbon. You can see how it manifests. And as you can see from this flux, I think it can be pretty dramatic, but I think one thing to keep in mind is that the terrestrial carbon pool is very balanced. In an undisturbed environment, 99% of a tree that falls in the forest will go back as CO2 into the atmosphere. and 1% will remain in the soil. Now, it takes a long time for that to happen. And as you can imagine, 1% over time, it takes a long time to build soil. So these interventions, right, tilling, killing plants, things like that, release soil to, carbon to the atmosphere in a way that is hard to replace quickly. So I wanted to give you guys just kind of a shot of, like, these are, these outcomes, these ranges of outcomes, and how we treat our soil ranges really dramatically, and historically has diverged a lot. And so you see here, these are farmers with basically a profile of their soil. And this is in Niger, Syria, and the Los Plateau in China, respectively. And there are places that have been cultivated for a really, really long time. And as you can see, there is not much. The soil is pretty light, quite sandy. There's not much life in the soil. For comparison, this is Iowa, the dark soils of Brazil, and Washington State. So places in which you have much, much, much darker soil, much higher levels of soil organic carbon, and consequently much more fertile soil. So how we treat the soil really changes both what's going on inside the ground and what it's capable of doing, and also how much carbon it holds, and how that kind of, all these behaviors all stack up to something that actually affects climate change. So what are the things that we know now, right? So carbon comes from the air, it becomes life, and in the form of plants and microbiome, and it's released from the soil by decomposition. We can speed that up when plants, are either harvested or killed, or the soil is tilled, right? And this understanding, right, that ultimately what we do to the soil matters, and that these are our levers with which we can kind of change the content of our soil, is the basis for regenerative agriculture. So now we have kind of done the micro level a bit. The regeneration in regenerative agriculture is soil regeneration. So there's a lot of different pieces of this, and can run through these different kinds of things. You're probably starting to hear a lot about this now if this is an area of interest for you. But essentially, it's taking care of taking care of the soil by planting perennial crops. So instead of plants that you would have to seed and consequently till, or plants that you'd have to harvest, and then you're driving tractors over the ground and pulling things up. So perennial crops, integrating trees into the environment, because they're able to basically push a lot more carbon into the ground, avoiding tillage, and integrating animals into basically the use of the soil or the land to support the microbiome. This includes things like rotational grazing, which basically is moving animals around a paddock or a grazing area in a way that allows the natural kind of forage to regrow. No-till, so obviously we talked about plowing and tillage a lot here, but no-till drills and some other technology allow farmers who want to plant seeds, or even annual seeds like basic corn, wheat and so on, but don't want to till their soil, a way to do that. No spray. So obviously, if you want to keep the soil microbiome alive, spraying it with fungicide and so on, or it's not going to be beneficial for that. And then agroforestry, you see the cows grazing under trees. It's a way of integrating a system basically for helping store carbon while also growing trees, tree crops, timber crops, and also livestock. Silvopasture, similar, and you can just see here is kind of it's farming in a way that looks pretty different. So those are kind of at the farm and forest level, and I want to talk about two interesting things that we're working on, and I think are relatively novel that have to do essentially with like, okay, what are other things that we can do beyond a regenerative ag to try to build soil carbon. And this is what the burning question is about. So I have a lot of stuff to say about biochar, but essentially the question is, can we just add carbon to the soil? So we know we want to get more soil carbon and get soil carbon out of the air. And soil carbon helps us things like water retention and so on. Can we just add carbon to the ground? Well, what you're doing when you add compost to your soil is that, right? But to a certain extent, that is it's adding something that will break down over time. So most of the carbon that you add to a crop with compost will go back into the air as CO2. What about that recalcitrant soil carbon that I talked about right at the beginning of the conversation? Well, that is primarily what's called pyrogenic carbon or biochar. And it's naturally occurring, right? So imagine a forest fire or prairie fire, anything that doesn't burn completely and turn to ash, but has been burned sufficiently that it's converted most of the things in that biomass or tree or plant into pure carbon, then sits in the soil, right? And this is something that is, if you look at the way a normal tree falling in the forest, about 99% of it goes back to the atmosphere. If a tree burns in the forest, about 10% of it will remain in the soil. Now, this ends up being a lot of carbon over time, right? So let's see. Yes. Okay. Here we go. So this is an idea, just giving you an idea of how much of this pyrogenic carbon there is in the atmosphere. I mean, in the soil. About 4% of the Earth's surface burns every year. And this results in an enormous amount of pyrogenic carbon, biochar, which you can see is pretty much everywhere on Earth. It's 200 billion tons of pyrogenic carbon, and it corresponds with a lot of like the most productive soils on Earth. If you look at this, you'll see that the high plains of the United States, as well as the breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine, are places where there's an enormous amount of pyrogenic carbon. Anyone have any guesses why that is? Okay, lightning strikes the prairie, it burns, but the prairie grasses are perennial, right? So they're actually, unfazed, right? They burn a little bit. You have a layer of char that comes down, forms part of the ground. You do that for 10,000 years in combination with huge grazing animals or herds of grazing animals, and you end up with extraordinarily fertile soils. So I think, what does biochar do in the soil? Well, it's, as you can see from these images in the top right, it's extremely porous. So when you make biochar, or when biochar is made naturally, you're essentially taking a piece of carbon, a piece of biomass, and you're taking out everything that's not carbon, but you're not altering its structure. It doesn't like crush or something like that. So if you have, a piece of wood and you recognize the grain of that piece of wood, if you were to take it and turn it into biochar and you were to take it out, it would look exactly the same structure, everything. Now, all living plants have a lot of internal structure to them, right? They're moving liquid throughout them. And as a consequence, all that stuff gets turned into holes that then can be lived in by basically the whole microbiome. So fungi, bacteria really like being in there. You could think of it like a coral reef for soil microbiology. And it helps in a bunch of different ways. But some kind of main ones are, it's really good at capturing nutrients. So that middle graph there, if you break it all down, basically means that biochar can hold 18% of its weight in ammonia, which are nitrates, which are things that plants nitrogen, basically things that plants need to grow. It's also really good at helping facilitating exchange between soil microorganisms. So soil microorganisms use electricity to exchange energy. Because biochar is a little bit conductive, it allows them to do that a little bit faster. It makes them happy. They're like, instead of having to do everything by barter, they can send things by we'll call it like soil Bitcoin. And then the bottom right-hand corner there, you have basically the effect on the soil. And now this is not, I don't want to say that biochar is a panacea, but you do end up with, in situations in which you have degraded soil or soil that is not particularly healthy, adding biochar to it, particularly biochar infused with some microbiology, can end up dramatically increasing yield. So, doubling, but also, I would say most of the data that I see is about 30% increase in yield. So that's exciting, and I think opens the door of like what you can do with a microbial community. And this is another thing that I just saw a presentation, and I've been chatting with a guy named Colin Averill of the Crowther Lab at ETH Zurich, which is leading academic institution on global ecosystem restoration. And they're doing some super interesting things on basically manipulating microbial communities in the soil. So they don't just matter to how much how much carbon is brought down to the soil. They also affect how the trees grow themselves, right? And as a consequence, they kind of affect the overall environment. So the hypothesis is that differences in soil microbiology can dramatically change productivity of plants. And they've been tracking here in this little graph they've been tracking about 300 sites across Europe over the last 20 years, and have been tracking all of these different variables in forestry environments. So the climate, the soil nutrients, the tree size, characteristic types of trees. And over the last 2 years, they've been adding an interesting thing. They've been having foresters also capture some soil from these places. And they've been looking at the soil biome really closely, as in they're genetically sequencing the fungi in the soil to see if the changes in the soil microbiome affect how much soil carbon there is in the soil and how fast the plants grow. And here's what they've found. So if you look at the graph on the right, this shows tree growth on the y-axis, and on the efficiency of fungi, or proxy for it, on the x-axis, right? So the farther right you go, the more efficient the fungi is at its job, we'll say, in this community of taking resources and delivering them to a tree. And it looks like, okay, well, it's going up and to the right a little bit, but actually the y-axis is actually a log scale. So what they're representing is a difference of about doubling the productivity of a tree when controlling for all of the rest of these variables. So their hypothesis, and they're basically going to try to prove it out, is can we choose, or can we figure out a way to propagate beneficial fungi and willfully determine or support really beneficial soil microbiology to enhance soil carbon, above ground tree growth, and soil carbon capture. And so what they're doing now, they've started to test it, and they're planting trees with and without this rich microbiome. Now, keep in mind, what are they actually doing? Well, like, this is pretty, I would say, cutting edge science, and yet they still don't really know how to say, okay, we're going to take this microbiome and we're going to put it over there. So what they're currently doing is they're going to a local old growth forest, so somewhere in the nearby region that is an ancient forest. They're taking soil from that and they're planting it with these new plants. So, so that is what they're going to try, and we're going to see if that kind of if what they're observing with soil microbial communities can impact the way the plants grow. Now the question, of course, is like, will it work? And if it does work, how will we know it's working? And particularly around the soil carbon side, it's really hard because tracking soil carbon gains is super difficult. So with all that, all those kind of forest and farm level stuff, we're going to put that aside and we're going to move on to the last portion of this, which is just about carbon markets. So why do the carbon markets focus so heavily on trees right now? And is there a soil carbon market coming? So to understand soil carbon markets, start with trees, right? Why? Well, essentially we've focused on trees because we're really good at measuring trees. As you can imagine, people have been measuring, trying to capture the amount of wood in forests for a very, very long time, and we've gotten really good at it. So this means that we understand across a lot of different variables, species, trees, growth rates, amount of rain, etc. What we expect, how much of a tree we expect, how much is it going to grow, and consequently how much carbon is it going to take out of the atmosphere. And we also, because we have it over such a long period of time, we have really good data sets and really good data sets over time. Now, this, as you can imagine, is really great for kind of next generation monitoring. So now they're doing a lot of what's called remote monitoring. So we're getting really good at what happens above the ground. We're taking all the our experience tracking, and instead of going into a forest and say counting the number of stems and measuring them at chest height and saying, okay, this is exactly how many board feet or pounds of carbon are in all these trunks of trees, we can use the data that we've amassed, run machine learning and satellite imagery, and use things like LiDAR and radar to evaluate the amount of carbon in a stand of trees without actually having to go there. Obviously, that's an important thing, because if you're buying carbon, you want to make sure that it actually exists and it doesn't burn down or get cut down. But also, you don't want to spend tons and tons of time and energy sending people to wander out in the forest and check each tree. So this is, I think something like 70% of all carbon offsets right now are above ground, so basically forestry-based credits, and they don't take into account soil carbon. So why is soil carbon next, right? So first of all, the voluntary carbon offset market is growing really quickly, and we're seeing increasing pushes into levels of sophistication in the carbon offset market, right? This last group on the right there, you have Pachama, which is a startup that does forestry monitoring and verification. They just signed large contracts with Microsoft and other people that are really starting to now feel like, okay, we've got to take this seriously. And offset prices are kind of all over the place in the tree front. But there's definitely an amount of, okay, well, how do we make sure these voluntary markets are going to be able to keep up with demand for carbon offsets? Well, soil carbon is super important because it's about let's see, 3 times the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere and 4 times the amount of carbon in all living plants and animals, right? So it's a much, much bigger pool. And as I said, we've lost so much of it that there's an opportunity to do a lot more, right? So we are starting to see the launch of next generation soil carbon platforms that are both paying paying farmers to change their, to sequester soil, and are also doing some monitoring on it. The main ones here, or a couple here, are Indigo Ag, and they've raised an extraordinary amount of money and are really scaling up quickly. And Nori, which is another marketplace that are starting to pay people to do this. You may have even heard of Hudson Carbon, which I think is a platform which is in development that's based here in the Hudson Valley. The interesting and kind of difficult part about this right now is that we're going to see a real change in how these develop, in that currently what they're paying people for is change in practices. So instead of they go out and ground truth on occasion, but it's really hard to do this, especially at the scale that they want to, and especially considering how variable the individual amount of carbon is in an individual piece of soil. And so modeling this all out is very difficult. And at present, what's happening is they're saying, okay, we're going to pay farmers to change what they're doing, and we're going to, and we think based on our models that that's going to change the amount of soil in the ground. So then I guess what's happening at, I want to give a lot of time for questions. So what are the kind of things that we're working on at Wally? Well, we're starting to kind of experiment with trying to increase the density of the biomass that can be produced on site. So planting trees that allow us to capture a lot of carbon from the soil and do it in a way that you capture a lot of above ground carbon, the trunks and stems of the trees, but also in the roots of the soil and the soil itself. In addition to that, exploring biochar production and an integration with a greenhouse and maybe a microgrid, so that we can start using the biomass produced on site, or perhaps regional or local waste biomass, to start turning that into heat, so we can use that in greenhouses, and also char, so we can draw down carbon while we're heating a greenhouse. So those are projects that are we're working through what those should look like and how we are thinking about them. But yeah, I think that's most of what I wanted to cover. But I really welcome questions, and I want to make sure that there's a lot of stuff we just covered, and some of it is going to be relevant to, I hope, each of you, but feel free to jump in.
I have a question, Peter.
Yeah.
I really find interesting what you're saying about the carbon and having the little nooks and crannies where a microbiome can kind of move in.
Yep.
It's a two-part question. What's kind of the time scale of that once you put it in the ground, and when does that microbiome start to form a home within that carbon? And then also, can you use carbon to enrich compost and things like that to kind of speed up the process, or basically further enrich the process of that kind of material?
Yeah. Okay. So so second one first. So yes, you can absolutely use biochar to help facilitate the breakdown of your compost. People that do this at scale, there are people that do this at scale of companies that do biochar enriched compost. And they add about 10% carbon by biochar by weight to their compost. They mix it up, and then because it provides a really good environment for microbes, it tends to increase the speed at which the compost matures. So you can save time and effort, and consequently, it's part of the reason that they do it is it's beneficial to them, right? They can make more compost more quickly, and they can make better compost, right? One of the things that I didn't say is biochar is high bulk volume, low density. So it helps create air and lightness in the soil, and which can be really beneficial for people who want to have garden mixes or potting soil and things like that. And then timelines. Okay, so it's an interesting question because different parts of the soil microbiome behave differently. So part of that recent study that I was reading suggests that essentially fungal soil, like fungal dominant soils or fungal based soils, don't move around as much and are pretty stable. So once established and healthy, they will stay there and they will persist, right? So they were talking about having introduced fungal little composts into these communities, and then gone back and found the same signature, still the same fungi was living there like 20 years later. So I don't think the same is true for bacteria. But so that's kind of like a duration question, but how long does it take to what they call inoculate biochar? So like fill a some biochar with life. About the time it takes to compost something. So you could, a couple months max, but you can also speed that up with things like compost teas and so on.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question in the chat.
Okay, here, let me see if I can find it.
At the bottom from Edward and Morse.
Yeah, hi, Edward. Is biochar a meaningful process not at scale? For example, would this be a useful thing to do for soil, say on an acre plot? And what would it cost to look like to do for something at scale? Yeah, great question. So, so it's super easy to make biochar. As you can imagine, like what you're doing is lighting something on fire and then putting it out. Now, it is more complicated than that at some level, because I think a good analogy for biochar is maybe brewing beer, in which the inputs are super common and the process is very straightforward. However, how you do it and exactly what you do changes the outcome a lot, right? And especially like what you start with will change what you end up with significantly. So making biochar out of, trimmings from grass and making it out of oak, well, you'll end up with very different char. Now you can do a similar thing to it, and you will end up with a similar, in some senses, outcome result, but the biochemical portion of it is pretty different. You end up with different chars in the same way you would end up with different beers or different loaves of bread, right? So you can do it yourself, and a lot of people do it themselves. And you could dig a hole in your backyard, and there's tons of stuff on YouTube on how to do this. And it's cheap, but it's time intensive. It takes a lot of time to make it, and so if you want to make a small amount and you want to stand outside and you have lots of extra brush you want to get rid of, by all means, go for it. But I'm of the opinion that industrial, having industrial or semi-industrial setups, pyrolyzing facilities, making biochar would be better, because for a variety of reasons. One, you can capture the heat that you create when you make biochar, and you can turn it into something useful. Heating a greenhouse, turning into process heat, doing something with it, right? If you just do it at home, that tends to just go into the atmosphere, and that's just a carbon loss. So in the carbon math, that's a negative. Also, you can be more particular about what you're aiming for. Okay, I want to have a biochar that's really good at storing water, or I want to have a biochar that is particularly good at filtration of, I want to get the algae out of my pond. Like I want to target it at that, right? So I think if you're thinking through, how would I do this, or what do I want to do here? You could buy the biochar. There are regional distributors, and I'd be happy to connect you to one who sell it, at relatively big scales, and it costs anywhere from $300 to $500 a ton. And if you wanted to make it yourself, you could make it for free, but also making a ton of it would take a lot of time. So if you wanted to put down some on an acre plot, application rates range from, say, 5 to 10 tons an acre. And currently, right, that's not, people are like, okay, well, that's going to be a lot of money. I'm not sure I have enough, I can see the benefit from that over a short period of time. And so that's why you don't see a ton of biochar usage in ag environments. But I do think with carbon markets coming online and biochar producers being able to sell credits for the sequestration of carbon that they're doing, I think you'll likely see those bulk rates of biochar fall over time. So that's kind of one hope for biochar, is that we get more field application as industrial processes scale up and as carbon markets certify and provide more liquidity to pyrolyzer, to people who want to pyrolyze feedstock. Did I answer your question there? I hope that was.
Yeah, very, very, very thoroughly and comprehensively. Yeah. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Daniel, deeper roots for winter in the Northern Hemisphere. I actually don't know if that's true. I suspect there are there's selection biases in both directions there, because I suspect that if you go down a certain amount, you'd get to permafrost. So I don't know how boreal forests handle that. But you do end up in the northern climates like that, boreal forest peat bogs, basically. So super, super, super high density from a carbon perspective soils that are just kind of sitting there. and this is one of the reasons that climate change is like scary around the northern forests, because we don't really know what's going to happen to all that carbon in the soil as it unfreezes. Does anyone have any other questions before we wrap?
I have one more.
Sure, yeah.
So within biochar, as kind of the overarching general term, are there specific things that, let's say like bone charcoal versus wood charcoal, would one of those be better than the other for putting back into the soil, tracking microbiome, their structures, or is it kind of like everything has structure?
Yeah, okay, well, so to answer a question that was not asked but is related to this one, and I feel like it's something a lot of people want to know, which is biochar charcoal, and is charcoal biochar, and which one is the umbrella term, and so on. So char is the top level term, and that is just any sort of biomass. So anything that was once alive, any sort of organic anything that you heat up but you do not burn, right? You don't combust it to ashes, but you heat it up enough so it breaks down. All of that is char. Charcoal is the word that means char for heating. So charcoal for cooking, charcoal for smelting, charcoal for all those things, right? For heating applications. Biochar is non-heating applications of char. Mm-hmm. So in that context, okay, so there are lots of different kinds of char. The focus, so you have, when you want different things in char, you search for different kind of characteristics in the underlying feedstock. So for example, softwood has more space inside of it. So like Douglas fir and pine, things like that. And they make for biochars that hold more water.
Interesting.
Manure, right? You can, if you can burn a tree, you can burn anything, right? And that makes for a high nutrient biochar, but it is not as what's called recalcitrant. It doesn't stick around in the soil as long because it's not as hard, right? If you take an oak tree and you take out everything that's not carbon, it's still really tough. It's likely to be there forever. Well, I mean, the scientific thing is somewhere between 500 and 1,000 plus ? Years. But the half-life of like manure-based biochar is only something like 50 years. So what you're shooting for is kind of, there are different ways to think about it. So I think about, initially as part of this research, it was like, you talk to people, you hear people talk about and refer to biochar in kind of in the same way that people would talk about fertilizer. So you put it in, then your soil performs better. And then the next year, maybe you put more in, right? So it's kind of like the view of it would be, is it that it was analogous, right? And it's actually not really analogous. It doesn't really break down in the soil. So year over year, you're just adding more, but last year's biochar is still there, right? So thinking about it as fertilizer is not really the right analogy. It's more like you're adding structure. So like you're like showing up with mobile homes for all of your fungi, right? And they like it more there, right? And if you want to put in more next year, great, right? but the old ones are still there. It's fine, right? And if you want those, and if people want to put biochar in their soil, one of the most common things that you saw in the movement, say 10 years ago, is people putting biochar they had just made or raw biochar on their soil, and then being like, oh, it didn't help, it even hurt my yield. Like, what's the deal? Well, imagine biochar it's a hyperporous thing that is essentially inert. Well, so it's like kind of like a sponge. So it will suck up nutrients and hold them there. Now, if you've got super fertile soil, that's great because plants can get in there and stick their roots in there and grab them, and they won't wash away, wash off, right? So you can develop, which is what you have in the terra preta soils in Brazil, hyper dense, super nutrient dense soils, right? But if what you want is for it to grow, like, you don't want to have it show up with no nutrients and no life in it. It takes the life, it takes soil microbes time to colonize that space. It takes nutrients time to fill up all the empty pores. And in that time, it's actually pulling nutrients from around it in the soil. So it's reducing the nutrient availability to the plants around it. So obviously that's not what you want. So how do you counteract that? Well, you buy, and this is kind of what people do now, right? This is what is considered best practice, which is you combine your biochar, a structure, with nutrients, usually in the form of natural compost or manure, chicken manure. There's an entire company based around chicken manure and biochar, or poultry litter and biochar, as fertilizer. So you combine structure, nutrients, and life, right? And you take take a microbiome of something, so your compost pile or whatever, you mix those together, you let it sit out, and then when you're putting it into the soil, you're putting in not like an empty sponge, you're putting like a totally juiced up sponge into the soil. And all of the plants are, instead of being like, oh, where did that nitrogen go? I guess it's stuck in there. I guess I'll have to go get it. They're like, oh, okay, wow, there's all this stuff and it's right there. So that's kind of like, that was a super long answer to your question, but I like that. That's
just what I was looking for.
That's what I was. Those are all the questions that I ended up needing to ask after I asked the question that you asked.
It spawned another question, but I'll hold on to that one.
Yeah.
Can you put too much carbon in the soil over time? Can you over carbonize the soil? Is that even possible?
So
at massive scale?
Yeah. So theoretically, yes, but soil carbon rates are so low. So most soil in the United States has under 2% soil carbon. And diminishing returns happen somewhere above 5% or something like that. And really, we don't understand that much because we haven't done this. Like adding lots of carbon to soil is not something we've been capable of really doing. And especially at the volume you would need to do, right? So people put a lot of compost on their land, but compost, as from a soil perspective, doesn't last very long. 3 years, maybe 2 years, something like that. If you were to add biochar to soil, it would last a long time. And the hypothesis around how you get these hyperdense soils that you do see in some places. So for example, the plains of the United States, Great Plains breadbasket in Ukraine, terra preta, like what they talk about is, imagine you're working with, imagine the Great Plains, right? So you have a perennial plant, super deep root systems, like 20 feet of roots. And it grows and is turned into manure. So by grazing, it's like rotationally grazed by buffalo. So they put down a layer of nitrogen, phosphates, right? And then it burns, and then you have a layer of char, and then it grows up again. And you do this again. You do that 10, 20, 100,000 times, and you end up with soils that are 20 or 30 or 40 feet thick, right? You end up in the same thing. So the kind of working hypothesis of how people did this in the Amazon was they lived along the river. They cooked cooked and ate a lot of fish, which has a lot of nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphates in it. They would deposit all of their sewage out behind their house. And then instead of doing kind of what's normal, what people talk about as slash and burn now, they would char and then spread it on top of their sewage. Now keep the smell down, but also keep animals away and keep runoff from happening. Right? It's like you just we're just dealing with our sewage, right? And this is still an effective way of dealing with sewage. So you do that over a couple 100-year period, and you end up doing kind of the same thing that happened at the plains level. Also, they take their pottery, which they've been eating fish on, and they like throw it out there, and it breaks down to the soil. So you do that for a long time, and you end up with these similar things. So, like, can you do too much? I mean, I guess you could do too much at once is my answer, but we don't really know what that is. Like, there are some people that are starting to try to do, 40 tons an acre or 50 tons of biochar an acre, but those experiments aren't that old.
Yeah. And
I don't think we really have an answer to that. My short-term thing is basically like, I would love for someone to try it. I would love for someone to be like, we're going to see how fast you could possibly, what's the upper limit for building soil? But I don't think there's some like physical limit.
Lex Luthor. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course.
There's one more question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Yep. What is the effect of biochar on a soil's pH? Great. So biochar is basic generally, but it's not that does not hold for every kind of biochar, nor every process. So ash is very basic. So if you make biochar that has a lot of ash in it, as biochar does, that if you're making it at home, it's probably going to have some ash in it. So it'll probably be basic, and that's probably good for most soils. Most soils are acidic, and as a consequence, this is the slash and burn is all about getting ash, which is basic, and putting it on acidic soil that's too acidic. So it's actually like, okay, great. But if that's not what your soil needs, and you really want to use biochar, I don't know them off the top of my head, but there are biochars that you can get that are processed in ways that have very low ash, or essentially no ash, and are not using a feedstock that's basic. And as a consequence, you end up with a soil amendment which is neutral, and you can add to your soil. So there's not a broad stroke, if you have basic soil and you don't want it to be more basic, like be careful with what you're doing. But most everyone else should not worry about it. In fact, probably putting some ash straight on your soil would probably benefit you from a productivity standpoint. All right. Well, yes. So this is the end of our session. It's been so fun to talk with everyone. And I'd love to dig in with anyone that finds this stuff interesting. I tweet and write about all these things, but also, I live in Hudson, and for those of you that are in the Northeast or in Hudson in particular, I'd love to chat and, meet more people that are experimenting with this. I think this is a hugely hopeful technology, and I really hope that it can be, seen both as something that can help the environment in broad strokes, carbon down from the atmosphere, but also can be something that feels really positive in that we're turning a liability in the air, something that warms the earth and we don't want, into an asset in the ground, something we can use and something it will really help. So thanks so much for the time.